Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the last forum of the Winter Forum season. History and ecology teach us about the inevitability of change, and in this century, the climate is changing faster than ever. Warmer temperatures and record low precipitation in the recent California drought left 100 million trees dead in the mountains, and California cities and agriculture vulnerable. David Ackerly, climate change biologist and professor at UC Berkeley, has been studying how fast plants and animals may need to migrate uphill or northward as the planet warms. These velocities could be as high as 5 miles per year, exceeding the ability of most species to find new homes and establish new populations. Today, we're going to be talking about our responsibility in a changing climate and how to prepare the next generation for a changing world. David, thanks so much for joining me today. I was hearing some of the conversations among our audience today. It was about wildfires. And just having been on a plane trip from Oaxaca, Mexico to here, we saw dozens and dozens of fires on our way. And when we were there, this air quality was severely affected by wildfires. And even in my life, I look at the Berkeley Hills, a place that I'm just so intimately familiar with. Went up there on a daily basis. And it just seems worn out. It may be just the age of the trees that maybe they've all been planted at the same time. Maybe a little bit of that. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you're seeing, whether that impulse that I see where I look at these places that are familiar places and they're drying up. To what extent is that true? Am I really noticing something that's really happening?
It's definitely happening. We know that. And I think when we talk about wildfire in California, we would really date what we think of as a modern era of megafires to 2014, the Rim Fire. I think for a lot of people, fire was kind of a background happening somewhere else, unless maybe you're in San Diego and they'd had some very severe fires. But 2014, there's the Rim Fire, and it's followed by Lake County fires, Wine Country fires, and then Caldor and Dixie in 2020. So it's been this extraordinary decade. It's also important to remember that fire has always been part of California.
Yeah.
And what many people actually don't know, and I only learned after many years working in Berkeley, is this year was the 100th anniversary of the 1923 fire, when more than 400 houses burned right on the northern side of the Berkeley campus.
Yeah, I was always really conscious of that because the architecture is so different.
Exactly.
All these Art Deco houses are plopped down in the midst of these arts and crafts.
That's right. So you're going along the street with all the old wood, craftsmen, and then you pop into these more modern, and that's where that fire occurred. So fires are not new to California, and in fact, we know that going back, Native Americans have burned in California, had set fires and managed the landscape. But something's changing, and certainly going to impact us going forward. Climate's part of it. We absolutely know that with hotter temperatures, drier conditions. It's absolutely part of it. Makes the trees more vulnerable. Also, how we manage the forest is part of it, and also where we've chosen to live is part of it. Because climate is a driver, but our vulnerability is there's other factors there, and those are things that we have more control over. At the same time that we try to tackle climate change. And we just have to look at all the pieces of the puzzle and think about what can we do to just reduce our vulnerability going forward.
Yeah, so growing up, my girlfriend fought fires for the CDF, California Department of Fires, and my brother also was a firefighter for the federal government. So we were really aware of fires and what seasons were bad seasons and which ones were good seasons. But like I said, it's just I wasn't having the sense that the landscape itself was wearing out. And like I said, if I go up to fire trails in the Berkeley Hills, it's just not the same as it was when I was a young person.
Yeah, I mean, some of those trees are old, and no tree lives forever.
Yeah.
but when we have drought years, that compounds it. So we see pine trees dying. The eucalypts, of course, seem to be pretty resilient. And quite flammable. And that's of course a big management issue for Berkeley. Is just what kind of vegetation do we want on those hills?
Right, exactly.
And East Bay Parks is tackling that very actively as we speak. But what we saw across California we had this major period of drought, 2014 to 2017, depending on where you are. But and as you mentioned, more than 100 million trees. I think we're over 150 million trees die. And this becomes more than 10% of all the trees in California. So, of course, trees store carbon, and we'd like that carbon to stay on the ground. So every fire is more carbon to the atmosphere. At the same time, the only way we're going to get ahead of these fire threats is to thin out the forests, because this century, especially in the Sierra Nevada, this century of suppressing fire and not managing the forests, and certainly the way that they would burn on a more regular basis before the 20th century. So ironically, we have to remove we know we have to remove a lot of understory, which is carbon also, out of the forest in order to make them more resilient going forward. And this actually has become a big management question, what to do with all that. It's very hard. It's really hard to do much with all that biomass we need to take out of the forest.
So what are the ideas in terms of, what do we do with that? Because that's a massive amount of biomass.
There's a lot of hope that we could use it for fuels, that you can actually, you can take wood, you can get it into the right kind of technology and generate energy, and that displaces fossil fuel energy. It's not economical at this point. There's no, we know that, just the cost of getting material out of the forest. There's hope of trying to develop new products, and certainly we have folks at Berkeley working on this. Can we develop a new wood products technology that uses all these smaller trees instead of using the big trees? And in the meantime, though, we're really facing that trade-off that we may have to accept that we're going to lose a lot of that, just in terms of losing that carbon, because a lot of it ends up having to be burned, burned in pile burns, not in wildfires. Right. But really what we want going forward is more frequent, lower intensity burns, to not have the big wildfires. And this gets to the air quality, and it's the other big trade-off we face, that, if the agency becomes very important here. So a wildfire, we actually have the expression act of God. That might mean something different. But when a wildfire occurs, there's this, we may go back and say, oh, here's the cause of that fire, but it was accidental, so, it was a mistake. So there's a sense that no one intentionally made this happen, and therefore all the public health impacts are just these unfortunate consequences we have to grapple with. But when we permit a prescribed burn and someone sets it, there's that sense, oh, okay, so we made an active decision, and that agency changes the way we deal with it. So even though the prescribed burning would be lower public health impacts in the long run, it's harder to do when we know that someone, actively made that decision and took responsibility for it. And so we have this paradox where we kind of accept things sometimes happening that no one made the decision and was in control over, and then we grapple with the decision that we have to take responsibility for it. And that's just one of many trade-offs.
I guess part of it is just like how distributed is the decision? Because, all those decisions to manage the forest in the way that we decided to manage them through the 20th century are certainly contributing factors to, what the fire situation is now. And yet, that's a different thing than, like you say, on, March 27th, we're going to be burning, have a controlled burn that's going to be in it's such and such hours we expect the wind conditions to be such and such.
Yeah, and we just hope that, we really believe if we do that right, yes, there are impacts, but they really are lower impacts, and it's a better path forward. But, we want a lot from our forests. We want carbon. We want them to not burn up and cause both, the amenity loss and the air pollution and the loss of timber. We want them to store water and feed the rivers coming into our dams. We want them to provide habitat for wildlife. We want to be able to go and walk in these beautiful places, and then, and we produce timber. And of course, timber is still our major building material for houses. Now, California's timber industry is nothing like what it was. But that's a lot of things to want from one ecosystem, and that means we have trade-offs and people with different interests, right? And it all becomes our governance processes, our decision-making processes about how to balance those. So there's no one straightforward, simple solution, but we have a pretty good sense of what the trade-offs are. I think that we have a much better knowledge of than we did maybe 20 or 30 years ago.
What other ways are we making advances from, in terms of where we are now versus where we were like 20 years ago? What are the primary advances in your field that you see?
Well, if you think about, the forest management, conservation biology, there's really been conservation biology and environmental stewardship have really undergone a reckoning, as everyone in society did, after the George Floyd murders. And this affected all aspects of everything we do. And it really made environmental, I would say, stewards and step back and think about who's making decisions and who are they be made on behalf of. So many of us, so I grew up, turns out we were both, grew up in Cambridge, Mass.
Yeah.
I grew up with parents who were bird watchers. They took us hiking. And for me, and that's why I do what I do. I grew up with that sense of just loving nature. But the 20th century in the United States, that ability to enjoy nature was not equally available to everyone. Yeah. And that was it almost became a privilege of its own. So one of the big changes in California, just in the last 5 years, has been very exciting, is really a really deep commitment by the state government to try to renew relationships with tribes, a really deep commitment to think about who has access to parks, where do we have parks, and really expanding that. I mean, access for all is one of the policy, or it's a document you'll find on the state government website, and it's making us rethinking education also. You know, how are we making our classes, who are we bringing into the university, of course, who's taking our classes? And we know that caring about the environment crosses all race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, condition. People may care in different ways, and we need to really see that it can mean different things in different communities. So that's not a scientific change, but it's been a very big social change in the way that people think about our work. The science has just been a steady increase. I mean, in understanding, of course, how the climate system works. In the last 30 years, our sophistication of understanding how all the pieces interact is changed enormously. And then realizing how plants and animals may respond. So opens up a lot of fronts.
Yeah, I mean, just the climate models themselves. I mean, just like weather prediction, it's astonishing how that's changed in the last 20 years.
It's actually really interesting combination of incredible sophistication and change, and yet the basics were very well known. Yeah. So you get a 1985 or 86 when Jim Hansen testifies before the Senate, and he puts up a slide, a very famous slide, of this is the projected increase in temperature in the next 40 years. We are still exactly within the band. Yeah. So on the one hand, some of the science is so simple, and I don't mean that in the sense that you just do the basic heat balance, heat in, heat out, trapping it. Some of that was understood so well that we've known very well what the general increase would be. But what we didn't know at that time is how would it play out in different locations? How would it impact drought? How would it impact fire? So the sophistication of all the pieces has increased enormously, and yet we actually knew 40 years ago the trajectory we're on.
You know, I love what you were saying just about how important our childhood experiences. I remember being in 5th grade, and the public school system sent us out to Cape Cod and I remember meeting an environmental educator named David Warren, and I know that had an impact on me. And there are a lot of inner city kids who never would have gone to Cape Cod if it hadn't been for that. But what kind of programs like that do you see now that are encouraging the love of nature for future generations of kids?
Well, there's a wonderful book. I'm sure there are people who know the title. It was about it's along that every child. I wish I had it tip my tongue. This concern that with the new generation of social media, it's quite a battle. Yeah. And if anything, we might feel like we're sort of slipping and losing in that battle. One of the really exciting ones under the Obama administration, this idea emerged of getting every 4th grader into a national park. And what the sense was like, well, 2nd grade is too young, and by 6th grade they're already distracted. 4th grade was the sweet spot. And in addition, if you give every 4th grader a pass to the national park, they take their whole family. Yeah. Now, I'm sure we didn't get every 4th grader to a national park, but that's just one example of finding that sweet spot for children when they still have a sense of awe in nature and maybe haven't been consumed by technology in front of them. And also so many programs that have developed, Latino Outdoors and others, that are trying to reach really diverse populations and just bring people into nature. Yeah. And for me, without that, I would, I sit at my desk at a computer most of the day, but that motivation for what I do still goes back to just that childhood experience, and that I can draw on that. And then getting out in nature.
Right,
Without
right.
it,
So how did you kind of find your way to where you are now? Like, between when you were a fourth grader, when you were a fourth grader, would people have been surprised that you ended up doing what you're doing now?
No.
That's what I thought.
I was a nature nerd, no question. And I joke that my parents really were big bird watchers. So my teenage rebellion is I was really interested in mammals. So that was a big deal. No, I was all in, and I loved it. I loved photography. I went to college. I was studying ecology. I actually got to go to Brazil, work in the Amazon after college. But then the really important event is I got to grad school, and the lab I was in is late 80s. In the 70s, they had been injecting sulfur dioxide into chambers, and that was to study acid rain.
Right.
And those chambers were then repurposed in the late 80s to inject CO2. So this was the early generation of plant biology research with elevated CO2 was just, elevating the CO2 in growth chambers and growing the plants.
Wow. How fascinating.
And this is what we call direct effects research.
Yeah.
And now, if you just put a single plant in a chamber and elevate CO2, it just grows faster.
Yeah.
In fact, horticultural greenhouses often inject CO2 to very high levels just to increase productivity.
Yeah.
It gets more complicated when things start interacting and competing and whole ecosystems. It's very different than growing in an agricultural setting or a horticultural setting. But from the late 80s till today, it's amazing when we look back that everyone focused on the direct effect and then realizing that the indirect effect, which is to say temperature rise, changing rainfall, have completely overwhelmed, become the dominant factors. And those were not as much the focus of research.
Right.
So I got that early taste in grad school. I kind of went off and did other things. I was doing tropical forest ecology, came out to California, studying our native vegetation. And then about 15 years into my career, I just had this moment where I was like, I think I should focus on climate change.
Yeah.
This is what I can offer as a researcher. So since then, all my focus has been thinking about how climate affects in the research, mostly California plants and biodiversity. But in taking everything I learned, the opportunity to have conversations like this.
Yeah,
exactly. Go way beyond the research.
For sure.
Yeah.
Some of the research that you've done on just, migration of species, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, in some ways, I when I talk to young people, I say, there's ways in which you can become an expert in something that just no one knew anything about 5 years ago because of changing technology, changing knowledge. But you grew up with climate change, and it did position you to understand things a little bit better. And I wonder if you can talk about especially about that species.
Yeah, that's right. This is what we call the velocity of climate change, and this is something I developed, just a simple idea in many ways, I developed with colleagues, but really it's about helping us think about the problem. But where a lot of this came from was people who studied how ecosystems responded at the end of the ice ages.
Yeah.
So paleoecology, which is the study of ecology in the past, had kind of been its own group of researchers doing their own thing. And then as climate change emerged on everyone's radar, all of a sudden everyone got very interested in what they've been doing. So all the knowledge that we've learned, especially, we had 50 ice ages through the 2 million years of the Pleistocene. But a lot of our knowledge comes from what the last 20,000 years looks like. So 18,000 years ago, we're at the height of a glaciation. The world is 5 or 6 degrees Celsius cooler. And we go through this dramatic period of warming. Now, the warming occurred over about 4,000 years. What we saw during that period was massive changes in plant distributions. So plants that have been, and you see it more strongly in the East Coast, partly because the data is better. The way pollen accumulates in marshes is where a lot of the data comes from. We don't have many marshes in California.
Yeah, exactly.
So the East Coast and Europe have a much better record. But there are species that were pushed down into the Carolinas, pushed down the Appalachians, that are now in Quebec. And that basic realization, it's like, when climate changes, plants and animals move. It is the primary thing. It's the primary response is they just shift and follow the climate that's suitable for their tolerances to conditions. So this is how we started thinking about it, that if you look globally, you see that trees migrate. Now, trees don't migrate. Individual trees don't migrate. Trees don't move. A seed moves, grows, reproduces, moves another seed, right? And the seeds don't know which way the climate is moving. So there are these random processes, like seeds get scattered in every direction, but the one that landed in the place where the conditions were right does better. Right. Over thousands of years, that's the migration of a species. So we know that if we give plants and animals 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, they can close to keep up and catch up with a changing climate. And that's where we got this idea that we really need to think about how fast does a species have to move to keep up. And when you do the math for this century, as he said in the introduction, some of these velocities are just, we know they exceed the ability of plants, especially trees, which have long generation time. So the key insight that came from that, though, which really caught a lot of our attention, and it's almost backwards when you say it until you think it through. The velocity of climate change is lower on the side of a mountain. And the basic idea here is that if you're in Nebraska and climate is changing, a species has to move a very long way or move quickly to track it. On the side of a mountain, you only have to go a little way up.
Yeah.
And it's the same reason that we would drive up a mountain to escape a summer heat and not try to drive to Oregon or Washington to escape summer heat. So mountains actually become a resilience factor, that biodiversity in these rugged areas has a better chance of responding. It's just a better chance in the sense that, just a little bit of movement will find suitable locations. So that's guided a lot of conservation biology, thinking about the importance of these very small scale patches, about where water is, where springs are. And this keeps a lot of us busy who like to run around and look at landscapes.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So there's some, you latch onto something like that and go, okay, there's an idea that we can work with. It's operational, like park managers can work with it, park planners. You find some hope in one regard, and we all want to work with that where we can find it. Nothing substitutes slowing down climate change. Yeah. This is all just how to, sort of play catch up.
Yeah. So, I mean, given that human beings are the cause of this velocity of change, how much are people thinking about just, being more active in terms of accelerating the movement of these species?
So people are thinking about it a lot, and there's certainly no consensus. So humans have a long track record of moving species around the world. A lot of those movements went really badly.
Oh, I know. I just think of the mongoose.
Invasive species, island species. Yeah, we know the islands. So there's just this sort of reaction of like, oh my gosh, this seems to always go badly. On the other hand, of course, gardening and agriculture is a global movement of plants all over the world. Right. And we depend on that for our food. Wherever crops come from, we may move them, grow them where they. So we kind of bracket it. On the one hand, we'll grow almost anything anywhere for agricultural purposes. Yeah. On the other hand, we see all these really negative effects of uncontrolled release or invasive species. So there are some species that probably will not survive unless we pick them up and move them, and if we care enough about those species. I focus more on just not individual species, but healthy ecosystems. And so actually, if we flip this around and say that some species won't move fast enough, what that means in place is we're going to see change. And going back to the wildfires, there are many, many places in California that burned at high severity, and there's no trees coming back because there's no seed sources left. All the trees are dead. So where do the seeds come from? And unless you plant, in some places we don't have the capacity to plant at that scale, we're seeing forests convert to shrubland. So these shrubs were always there in the understory, but the trees aren't coming back and the shrubs take over. And they're native plants. Mm-hmm. It's not like it's not an invasion of non-natives. These are all native shrubs, but it's not a forest. Yeah. And that's the kind of change where we may regret it viscerally. Like if you grew up in that place, it was always a forest. Right. And so there's first that response. Then we may regret it, very objectively. Like forests have certain values, whether it's timber or water, and we lost that forest. Yeah, the bird watchers. Yeah. And then another level, it's saying, well, nature is doing what nature does. And do we need to step back? And at some level, we have no choice sometimes. And then, what do we do if we want to? Are we going to embrace some of those changes and just accept the world's going to look different in the future? Yeah. Well, and part of it is we're the ones who generate the change, and so it does mean we have a different kind of responsibility than if it was just an asteroid hit the Earth and the climate change is real as all of that. Well, we do have responsibility, and that goes back to the agency. And I think that no one looks back at the end of the ice ages and applies a moral judgment.
Right.
that all those trees moved.
Exactly.
You know, but now we do have agency. So we do and we should and we can apply a moral lens to the fact, well, we did cause this. So we do have a sense of responsibility. It doesn't mean we can fix everything, but there's no contradiction there to say that we have an agency and responsibility here.
Yeah.
And I think that's what drives people's passion for trying to make a difference.
In what ways does California handle this well, and is it model to other places, and in what ways do we have a lot to learn?
Well, I think, I mean, any audience here will know that sort of what California does, as people say, spreads east.
Yeah.
And some of these have been so incredibly important. So you take the vehicle emission standards. So California is ahead of the federal government in passing vehicle emission standards in the early 70s. So when the Clean Air Act comes along, California says, wait a minute, you can't, you know, we're already doing that. And
Yeah.
California's always had an exemption to have more strict standards than the rest of the country. Now, if we were a small state, it would actually probably backfire because no manufacturer is going to make the California version of a car,
Yeah.
but we're a big state.
Right.
And so sometimes manufacturers have just decided, let's just make the California version of the car and make it available everywhere. And that's oversimplifying the story. But California has had an incredibly important role and continues to. And then when politics of the federal government has had a downturn, shall we say, in caring about these things, California has led. So when Jerry Brown was in office and Trump was in office, California kind of became the U.S. climate diplomacy around the world was coming out of California when it wasn't coming out of Washington. There's many, many more examples, but you know, we face this daunting global issue, and we know that California is only a few % of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And I think a lot of us who work here just believe and know, like, if we pave the way, if we show what's possible, and we think about, we don't put ourselves in a silo and say, let's just do it a California version, that we can have an outsized impact in the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We were talking a little bit about just that moral responsibility, and I just think of, the big extractive industries and, companies like Exxon, et cetera. And I wonder if you can talk just a bit about like moral responsibility of those companies, our relation to them through investment, et cetera.
Well, our first relation for most of us is just turning on the furnace in our home.
Yeah, right.
and unless you drive an electric car now, driving a car. I think about this one a lot. I think, first of all, we have all benefited from fossil fuels. I mean, our standard of living in this country and through the Industrial Revolution was driven by fossil fuels. Yeah. And we take it for granted. Now, at this point, California's grid is mostly clean, but even every time we turn on the lights, that entire technology was driven by having a cheap fuel. So we can't ignore that, and we can't ignore how many people in the world have yet to enjoy the benefits that we've enjoyed. This is a really deep part of the dialogue about the degree of inequality in the quality of life and what our responsibility is there. So we all benefited from it. Government policy encouraged it. Government, a lot of subsidies to fossil fuels, which improved the standard of living for Americans. So it's easy to point at fossil fuel companies and say, it's their fault. And believe me, they carry plenty of responsibility here for having suppressed science, even when they knew it was the case, pushing for policies that encourage fossil fuels because it's their business. Yeah. What's interesting is that I think a lot of us in California and around the world have taken this on as a personal responsibility. Like, what's my carbon footprint? And what's my personal contribution to climate change? There is some research recently showing that some of the fossil fuel companies knew that it was to their benefit to make us think it was our fault. And so there's a real quandary there. Like, we all have responsibility. And we can all make change. And we know that consumers, when consumers really shift, it can make a huge change in technology consumption in the marketplace. Most consumers are driven pretty heavily by how much things cost. Yeah. And not everyone has the luxury to make decisions that are really in the face of their pocketbook. And so I think, we should all embrace and feel great about everything we can do. If you're in the position to have an electric car, that's fantastic. If you're changing your light bulbs, that's fantastic. But the flip side is that no one should feel ashamed if they're not able to do it.
Yeah.
And I think shame doesn't motivate. It doesn't motivate in our personal lives. So if we can lift people up, but if the government policies don't drive the marketplace, don't drive the technology in a way that makes the average consumer be able to make a smart choice, this is not going to happen because 8 billion people make a simultaneous moral decision.
Yeah.
It's just too many people.
Yeah,
right?
well, I mean, it's all mediated through institutions, and you're right, it's like setting up the rules of the institutions so that they're farsighted and recognize the importance of the natural world, other creatures besides human beings, and recognize all of humanity too.
What you say about humanity is so important. I think, I say I grew up loving nature. So then if you love nature, you start thinking about biodiversity, and then of course you're thinking about climate. That's part of ecology. So when the climate changes, it seems like it's all an environment, like an environmental science problem. The other big change in the last 20 years is that the face of climate change is no longer a polar bear on a melting iceberg. The face of climate change is someone in their car fleeing a wildfire, or a farming community in the developing world facing a drought. So that's
thousands of refugees
and refugees, and this is so important. So I just talked about how plants and animals move, but people moving. I mean, this may overwhelm everything else in how climate impacts is the movement of climate refugees within countries and between countries. So maybe that's the biggest change, is that we saw climate change as something impacting nature, and realizing that it impacts all of us, and we're all in this together, and it's fundamentally, the impact on human. I mean, we can try to solve it for people, we can try to solve it for nature, but it's the same problem either way.
Yeah, right.
But the impact on people is just profound.
Yeah, it is. I think of scientists as having kind of a special responsibility with regard to climate change, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that as being kind of public leaders in addressing this huge crisis.
Yeah, it's interesting. So and of course we're facing skepticism about science in the United States, which is just sort of devastating. Again, living in a place like California, we value the fact that we don't have to deal with that day to day. That people embrace science, embrace education, embrace the universities, and our collective role. I think people, how do we combine the fact, scientists are humans, and every person has values, and yet we believe that somehow science should be protected from values in the sense that no scientist should go and do their work and just find the result that they wanted to find because of their values. That would undermine the nature of science. But the values come in a really important way, which is we all have to decide what we're going to spend time on. And I think a lot about medicine. So, I meet undergraduates and, all the time in my career, and ask them, what do you want to study? And many say they want to be a doctor. And you say, why? And they say, well, my aunt died of cancer. So the motivation, I mean, not all, but it's a story like that. So that motivation of why people want to do what they want to do is very personal, very value-driven. And for me, I grew up with an extraordinary sense of the beauty of nature. So this was a motivation for the research. Now, once I've chosen to ask a question in science, we have a bunch of rules, and we've discovered they work very well. And we need to follow those rules of how to do the science. So fundamentally, the values come into play with why we study what we study, but then also what we do with the information. And I think of climate scientists as like a planetary doctor.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
When you go to the doctor and they say, look, we've studied disease, we've studied the human body, and those symptoms indicate you have cancer.
Right.
And we trust that, we trust the science. And the doctor says, here are your choices. But now it's a value. Because the doctor doesn't say, science says you must have surgery or you must have radiation. And climate scientists are planetary doctors, where they're saying, we see the symptoms, we know the cause, and now there's choices. And the choices are value choices and political choices. So I don't think we need to shy away from that interface between the science and the values that we need to bring to the table.
Yeah, I wonder, just given that, just how do we prepare kind of the children who are coming up now? I mean, I think younger people are probably more likely to embrace the science of climate change. But how do we help them to prepare for the kinds of decisions they're going to be making?
I posed that question to a teen in my life recently, and they said, "Oh, we're totally prepared. We're growing up with this. It's compared to your generation."
Yeah, right.
I was like, "Okay, that's good. Yeah. I hope." I think, but there's one. But maybe the most important lesson that we learn all the time is people are. You can't be motivated if you don't have a sense of agency.
Yeah.
And if the only options seem to be despair and sort of disaster, then people turn their head in or turn to like, well, I'm just going to enjoy life while it lasts because it's not going to last for long. And that's not going to solve it. So even in the face of how daunting the problem is, the only option we have is hope.
Yeah.
And what we can offer a young generation, for those who've been studying the problem and are educating them, is not, environmental scientists got a bad rap as being the messengers of the problem.
Right.
And not the messengers of solutions. So we need to combine the sort of ethos of environmental science, looking at climate, with really the ethos of engineers who were trained to solve problems, build things, fix it. And a lot of us didn't grow up, I didn't grow up being told I was supposed to fix something. I just studied nature, and it was so fascinating, right? So climate, you'll hear the phrase climate solutions. Yeah. And you hear it, there's investment firms that are climate solutions. We're launching a new degree, climate solutions.
Oh, yeah.
And we just lean in on solutions because that's the biggest thing we can offer next generation is just learn about the solutions and then take it into any walk of life. You can be you can be a lawyer or a politician or a scientist or a doctor, or you can do anything and just bring it with you into what you do, because the solutions will be everywhere.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean everyone needs to become a climate policy leader, right? We need people in every walk of life bringing that knowledge.
What do you think the next 20 years are going to hold in terms of just those climate solutions? What are you seeing as the signs of greatest hope among people who are working on that?
So we're really, in general in this area, you hear there are the two words that the United Nations team settled on, mitigation and adaptation, have not proven to be great crowd pleasers in terms of understanding the problem. But certainly in the next, the mitigation part just means how do we slow down climate change.
Right.
Right now, as they say, electrify everything and decarbonize the grid.
Yeah.
So, and we see it at every turn, and certainly electrifying transportation, electrifying in our homes, and that's where government policies have been driving, have the most potential to drive things. Decarbonizing the grid is of course very different. If you buy an electric car in West Virginia,
right, and you burn
all the electricity was generated from coal, right?
Yeah,
so these
exactly.
two have to go hand in hand. The electric car is not any good if the energy is not being produced with renewables. So this is moving very fast, although we're seeing a downturn right now. We've seen, the first wave of consumers who loved their electric cars all bought them, and now it looks like the second wave, there's sort of hesitation. So we're going to see that. But I think we're not going backwards. We're certainly not going to go backwards. But what's really becoming apparent is we can't, for a long time there was a sense, let's put all of our eggs in trying to slow down climate change. And just not even talk about the fact that we may have to deal with it.
Right.
But that is no longer an option. And we know we have to deal with, the whole list, sea level rise and heat waves and droughts. And so in the next 20 years, we'll just see the necessity for big investments in making our systems more resilient. There was a headline in the Chronicle a little while ago, the cost of just addressing the seawall of the San Francisco waterfront is the same order of magnitude as the entire high-speed rail project. And that's just one city.
Yeah.
And think about the cities around the world. There's a reason we put big cities by the ocean. We started as a seafaring society, right? And all the big cities were there, and the boats came in, and then the cities stayed there. So even though with airplanes and trains, we still do. We still move a lot of things by sea, of course. So a huge percentage of humanity lives very close to sea level. Yeah. That's just one.
So that's one way of becoming uninhabitable. What are other ways? Will there be places that are just too hot to live in?
There will be, and there's actually something that are called wet bulb events. This phrase is beginning to percolate out, which is, when we get hot, we sweat.
Yeah.
And if it's hot and the humidity is very high, the sweat doesn't evaporate. And there is a threshold where humans die. There is simply, unless you have air conditioning or cooling. Some people here or listening may have read Ministry for the Future.
Oh, yeah,
It's
right.
become quite the guidebook almost to the century. And it starts with, it's a fiction, it's a fictional book. Kim Stanley Robinson, a science fiction author, extraordinary author. And it starts with just painting the picture of a wet bulb event when millions of people die, and he sets it in India, and which is only one of the places this could happen. There will be places that are uninhabitable outdoors.
Yeah.
And are we just going to develop massive indoor air-conditioned worlds that we live in? But in California, think in California, farm workers, construction workers, first responders. There's a lot of people whose work keeps them outdoors. Yeah. And then those communities become much more vulnerable. Yeah. And that's where we all share a responsibility for thinking about how do we protect everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I think so much about just what climate scientists, the kind of debates that climate scientists had in the 70s and 80s. What are the disagreements that they have about things? Currently, what are the big?
Probably the biggest one that is really which is much newer, is should we invest enormous amounts in the pathway to try to remove CO2 from the atmosphere? So CO2 removal and storage, it's very expensive. It's technically possible, but it's very expensive. And it was at $1,000 a ton to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and then either inject it underground in old gas wells or fix it in other ways. People say if we could get it to $100 a ton, it becomes economically viable. But we can't do it as an allowance to keep relying on fossil fuels, because we need to eliminate fossil fuels to the extent possible from our economy and probably also remove CO2. Right. So there are people who know the technology is possible and have decided that there are people who are absolutely committed. In fact, I think I saw Al Gore came out and staked this position, that being opposed to investing in CO2 removal because it just seems inevitable it's going to be used as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels. I don't know. I'll say I don't have a well-informed position. I can see both sides of the argument there. Yeah. And yet for other people, they're saying, if we don't do this, there's no pathway. There's no pathway to success if we aren't also trying to remove CO2. So as an example of something that wasn't even on the radar seriously 20 years ago, and this is actually part of what's called geoengineering.
Yeah.
And now removing CO2 is expensive. It doesn't, the side effects are social and political, going to be primarily, and very significant. Injecting aerosols in the atmosphere to sort of block the sun, the side effects are much more unknown. Yeah. And just unpredictable. And I guess I just hope we don't end up there.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to think we found other ways to solve this than that level of engineering the planet.
Yeah, those three options. It just seems so natural that you would address the easiest one to address, the one that we have the technology for, that doesn't have as great of externalities as the others. It just makes so much more. It just
easy technologically, but it requires the wholesale change of the way we run our economy and the way we run our lives. And then you'd like to say, if we just remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, then we can all continue with life as usual and not have to make all these changes, which can seem easier in some ways. But, and also, we have to do it forever if we go down that path.
Yeah.
And that's I don't know if that's a path we want to be on.
We'll be able to have that technology forever.
Yeah, and you'd have to keep employing it forever.
Right. Yeah. One of the traditions we have at the forum is we take questions from the audience, and so encourage anybody who has any questions to write those down. What do you think are just as things are changing? What do you think are the biggest obstacles now to addressing climate change in the way that we need to?
Unfortunately, there's kind of a list. There's a list. It's not. If it was only one, we'd be in a good position. there's no question there's enormous political obstacles. And it's so interesting watching the political problem, because on the one hand, we talk about how politicians are motivated by, in the United States, a 4-year election cycle. So if the problem's not going to occur within 4 years, there's no motivation to fix it. Interesting, that's not actually the case. Like Jerry Brown didn't shy away from doing massive investments because he was in his last term as governor. And Biden didn't shy away in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's actually, almost, in some ways, it's going the other way, that the political cycle requires that a politician can deliver results within 4 years, and it's hard to make these investments bear fruit that quickly. So in some ways, it's almost like it's come back on us the other way, that the politicians want to be able to, pass a bill, flick a switch, so to speak, and the rest of society is saying, look, we'll try to respond, but we can't respond quite that fast, right? So the political cycle works both ways against this. The political consensus, of course, is enormously difficult. And so we look around the world. China, there's a range of political systems, but if we contrast ourselves with China, with a much more centralized economy, when a country like China decides to do something that we might judge as like what we need to do, they can move faster and move more effectively. But when a country with a top-down economy takes a path that someone personally might not like, they can move just as quickly. So, we've chosen democracy. Yeah. We believe in it, but we're struggling to live with some of the results. Right. And that's the path we're on. So political is one, technological, social. And then addressing the inequality issues that, if you think at a global level or locally, when there's almost a pain in the Paris Accords are extraordinary, and this is the best thing we've got. Every country was asked to come forward and show their greenhouse gas reductions. Some of the poorer, smaller countries in the world are contributing so little that it's like, are we really solving the problem by asking everyone to come to the table, as opposed to those who have benefited the most making much bigger cuts and ensuring that the quality of life is really addressed for the world's poorest people? So simultaneously solving those fundamental problems of just caring for humanity is a big challenge.
Yeah, definitely.
Big challenge.
So here's some of our questions. I'll put my glasses on so I can make sure I read them properly. It would be interesting to compare investing in solution versus the cost of rebuilding from all the climate disasters. 2 authors to read, Catherine Hayhoe, Saving Us, and Christina Figueres. 2/3 of the world has faith connection. If we got together to create awareness and act, we could be so powerful. Every church should do an energy sustainability assessment, even in investing. Well, I love this, but what I love about it is that it does kind of raise a question for me too, which is, what are kind of what role does the environment play in your spiritual life, in your faith life? Like, how's your vocation as a scientist connected to your kind of your spirituality?
I grew up, like probably many in this country, as a Christmas Eve Protestant, going to church once a year. But then in the years I was raising children here in San Francisco, I actually spent many years attending the San Francisco Friends meeting, which just became an incredibly important part of my life. Now, I'm sad to say I moved to the East Bay. I didn't reconnect with the community there. I think for myself, one thing I appreciated about attending the Quaker meeting is you didn't have to answer the question of what your relationship is to God or who God is. That doesn't, I've never felt I needed to answer that question. So and everyone finds their own answer. I think that sense that what we're doing is profoundly about respecting the humanity of all around us is reinforced by our spiritual traditions in a way that science can't quite speak to in the same way. Actually, the other thing that's remarkable about where I found it very compatible as a scientist, spending time in the Quaker meeting, is, and for those who know the Quaker meeting, in the absence of a pastor, it's very much about your just being open to that personal experience. It's very empirical in that way. As science is. Right. No one's telling me what to think. You got to figure this out. So that was very compatible and very easy to integrate. But mentioning Catherine Hale is very important. One of the lessons that is well known across the entire spectrum is people trust messengers. It matters who they hear from.
Yeah.
And Catherine Hayhoe is a member of the evangelical community, and her husband's an evangelical pastor. So she's the best messenger to some audiences,
right,
who won't find me a trusted messenger.
Yeah.
And so the faith communities broadly, by being trusted messengers, can just play an incredibly important role.
Yeah.
And yeah, she's a wonderful example.
Yeah, it's really true. And I love what you say about just that, the nobility of the human being,
Yeah.
The dignity of every human being. And that's such a central part of,
Yeah.
what a spiritual life is for me. Oh, that's great. Okay. Are you aware of soil restoration that can help with climate change? Soil restoration.
Absolutely. So carbon, jumping right back into the ecosystem science, plants are built of carbon. So this is all about carbon right now. And so we talk a lot about growing forests to store carbon. And in some ways we focus a lot on the trees because we can see them. But trees are actually a very unstable place. All trees die.
Yeah.
They burn, they decompose. If carbon gets deep into soil, it's actually the one stable place you can really keep it in an ecosystem. There's a whole range of measures about whether it's in regenerative agriculture. Like every time a farmer tills a field, the oxygen the microbes that are brought to the surface have access to oxygen, and that stimulates the metabolism, and that can then vaporize CO2. Yeah. So where it's appropriate, less tilling or no-till agriculture, that can leave more carbon in the soil. Yeah. Regenerative agriculture has an enormous potential, and those who embrace it, and I have colleagues for whom this is their area of expertise, there are plenty of stories of farmers for whom first it's a real cultural change, but once they overcome the cultural change, often find that they're actually making more money because, where it used to be 8 passes across a field with a tractor, now it's only 2. That saves money.
Right.
So the bottom line can become quite profitable, but it's a huge cultural change, and that is slow. So all of these things are valuable. I think what I caution about as an environmental scientist is that everyone wants to be part of the solution, and everyone wants to promote. I can make a big difference, and I think some of the claims about what soil can provide are just more than it probably can provide. So let's not let anyone else off the hook. And actually one wonderful expression for this is there's no silver bullet for climate change, it's silver buckshot.
Right.
Which is to say, there's 1,000 solutions out there, and we need to employ every single one. Yeah. And healthy soil practices, absolutely one of them. But let's not tell anyone that, my solution alone is enough, so you don't need to pursue your solution as well, right? Because we need all of them being pursued simultaneously. Absolutely. But getting carbon deep into soils, and there's a whole bunch of methods for it, and a lot of exciting research and practice going on.
If you had much cheaper energy, what would you do as climate scientists? Like, how would you make use of that technological change?
If energy itself was cheaper?
Yeah.
Well, as the CO2 removal, as we said, would be, the first place that CO2 removal was tested was in Iceland, where the energy comes from geothermal.
Right.
So it's cheap and clean. Yeah. Because in the meantime, if we're using energy that generates fossil fuels to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, we're caught in a little bit of a bad loop, right? So not cheap energy, clean energy. Yeah. Clean energy is really where we need it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Here's a question. How do you solve overpopulation?
So remarkably, we've gone through a really interesting dialogue about population in the last 50 years, and 8 billion people is a lot of people. Yeah. And it really is a finite Earth. I think the first big real reckoning that came in the 70s and 80s is that a small number of those people are responsible for most of the consumption. Yeah. And there was a real sense that by focusing on population, it's also a way of shifting responsibility often to what are seen as the most populous or fastest growing parts of the world, where the standards of living are such that the impacts are not actually as large. Right. So it's just to say that all of us in the first world need to be cautious about pointing to population if it's a way of deflecting from our own consumption habits.
Yeah.
So that was the habits. That was the first real reckoning through the I think the 80s and 90s. But now some of people listening may have seen the New York Times article from about 4 months ago, where demographers are looking at the projection for global population, and it will peak. I mean, all signs are population will peak in this century.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if it peaked sooner. It'd be nice if it peaked a little lower. And so when I think about this, like humans, as long as we've been conscious of our collective humanity, have lived in a world where there were more people, constantly more people.
Yeah.
Our grandchildren will live in a world where the number of people is declining.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a really profound mental shift. Now, there's all sorts of economic issues about, Social Security, and are there enough young people working to support older people? And we see this happening in Japan. We see it happening in Italy. We've built an economy that's based on having a lot of young people to support, aging, our aging population. I don't know if we've quite figured out how to live. So sooner than we may think, we may all of a sudden be grappling with how to manage a declining population.
Right.
So it's enormous, but we need to focus on extending just the most fundamental, basic quality of life for people around the world, and not withholding that from anyone, the things we've enjoyed, and thinking a lot about, now that we've shifted so much to CO2 and water. I mean, there's a lot of other resources here, thinking about our consumption patterns and thinking about how to make it sustainable while we transition to making sure the world's poorest people have, the most fundamental rights. And then we'll find ourselves in 50 years, hitting a peak.
Yeah.
It's a pretty important 50 years.
It is. I just even think about the last 50 years. I was talking to Charlie Crocker like a few years ago, describing what life was like in the 1950s in California. And it's the same thing with me talking to my children, saying, gosh, I can't believe that Concord, California has 130,000 people living there.
Right.
It seems like a 20,000 person town to me still.
And then just to stay on California, though, for a moment, you go back 20 years, and California projected 50 million, and it was just a straight line.
Yeah.
And the combination of costs of living, and then the way people respond to the pandemic, and we're now, all the projections say California's reached 40 million, and it looks like we're going to stay here.
Yeah.
So California, I mean, and of course, that's a very local view of the world, but it's having to change the way we're planning. And we desperately need to solve a housing crisis. Solving it for a more stable population is going to be maybe a little more feasible than if we were still on that kind of trajectory.
That's true. Do you think that the recently launched methane satellite will make a difference, make the difference the scientists hope it will?
Well, I guess there's some business leader, this is always attributed to, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Yeah.
So, there's a fundamental truth to that. And methane, the fact that methane is leaking out of so many pipelines is one of those crazy things. Like, oh my gosh, just plugging leaks. It's not even being used productively. Whatever we think of fossil fuels, at least let's get some benefit out of it. So, I have no doubt the satellite will improve management. Now, the data is only as good as what we do with it. So we've got to have the political will behind it to get in, and whether it's fixing leaks in systems, whether it's changing the way that oil fields are managed and the flaring and everything. But there's, some here will know the dynamics of these short-term gases, which methane has a much worse short-term impact on warming, but then degrades more quickly. So there's a lot of benefit in the short run to really zeroing in and reducing methane reduction while we work on the longer-term problem of CO2 reduction. So hopefully, if we know where it is, we'll know where where to zero in on management, and also things like the Paris Accord. That's not a binding international treaty, but if you look at look at nuclear weapons as maybe our best example, or the ozone agreement, that they all have verification.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
There's no meaningful treaty without verification. So methane sat and then CO2 observation from space. If we're ever in a world of binding treaties, will become all important.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, at least they help us see where the problems are.
David, I can't believe it, but our time has run out. It just went by so quickly. I wonder if you had a chance to meet with President Biden for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, what would you say to him in terms of, what kind of message would you want to get across to him?
Boy, the first one is he really has done more. than any president before. So the first, I guess, is a thank you.
Yeah.
The second is, how can we keep these policies sustained? I think what's frustrating now is just this reality that it doesn't seem to matter enough to get more attention in the election. So if you listen to the State of the Union, climate got kind of a sentence or two.
Yeah.
And it's just that paradox. So even for a president who believes very deeply that this is something we really need to commit to, and has turned so much policy around the problem, that I guess it's not a message for the president, it's a message just wishing that it mattered more.
Yeah.
And so that it got the attention and drove more of our political process. But it's a long-term process. A lot of us are facing, our day-to-day, things that drive politics. So I guess I just wish I could see it make a bigger difference.
Well, I love that. That's a much better answer than the answer I was looking for. And the answer is that, because each one of us is the one who will make this issue matter for the people who are around us in our lives. And you've definitely equipped us, I think, today to be able to speak more intelligently about what's happening.
Well, I guess that's what we need to, we all of us who care need to let our politicians know that it does matter to us.
Yeah.
And it will affect our votes, and therefore we want to hear, and we want to, and have it make a difference at that level.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that we had this chance to talk today. I've got my little notes here. Next Sunday at 12:45 in the chapter room, Laura Cotilletta, Chief of Staff of the Giffords Law Center, will be talking about gun violence and the law as part of Grace Cathedral's social justice initiative, Beyond Thoughts and Prayers, Responding Faithfully to Gun Violence. The forum will return after Easter on April 14th with Jim Wallace on his new book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. You're welcome to join us upstairs for our choral Eucharist, and then we're also showing Home is a Hotel, and a film this afternoon. We'll also have a panel discussion after that. And we rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to the number 76278. So THINK to 76278. David, what a joy it's been to spend this morning with you. We're so grateful for what you're doing out there in the world, and we look forward to checking back in with you as new developments take place.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Sure thing.